Throughout the bloody battle for the Pacific, one class of fighting ship was always in the thick of the action. Its creed was to go in harm's way, and its motto, kill or be killed. From protecting the capital ships and bombarding enemy troops, to sinking submarines and bringing down the dreaded kamikaze, it took on the full ferocity of the Japanese and won. Always fighting at close range, they were the eyes, ears, and teeth of the American Navy, the destroyer.
Best damn ship in the Navy.
Thank God for the Fletchers, because I think the Fletchers were vital in winning the war.
Using extraordinary archive film and color reenactments, Battle Stations takes you into battle with a machine whose name says it all, the destroyer. April the 9th, 1942. Japanese troops capture the Philippine peninsula of Bataan. More than 70,000 Filipino and American troops are taken into captivity. It is the largest US Army in history to surrender, and one of the blackest days of the war. Army Commander General MacArthur vowed that one day he would return to retake the islands. But that day seemed a long way away. With the loss of Bataan, Japan appeared unbeatable. Poised to sweep across the whole of the Pacific, a shudder of fear reverberates throughout the free world. But on that very day, a ship with a radical new design was undergoing trials for the US Navy. It was the first of what would become one of the most successful fighting ships of World War II. The new Fletcher-class destroyers. The destroyer had its genesis as far back as the 1870s, when motor torpedo boats were used as a means of attacking battleships. Relatively small but extremely fast, they were usually armed with a single torpedo tube and some form of rapid-fire machine gun. By the outbreak of World War I, the torpedo boat had evolved into the destroyer and had become the backbone of navies throughout the world. But in the 1920s, cautious eyes were beginning to be turned east when the first of Japan's new class of destroyers was launched. These fast, heavily armed ships with 5-inch guns were more than a match for anything that the West had. As Japan's expansionist policies increased, so did her fleet. Soon, mighty battleships, carriers, and cruisers were all coming off the slipways. Germany and Italy were also hell-bent on building up their fleets as ship after ship took to the seas. But in America, very little was done to counter these threats.
The design of the American destroyer really was static into the 20s and early 30s. No new ships were built, many were decommissioned. So basically, the type of destroyer that the Navy, US Navy, had into the 20s and 30s was the World War I emergency program Flesch-Deckers.
As the world entered a crazy race to rearm, American naval designers finally took a hard look at these new battle fleets. What they saw was alarming. The message was clear. As a counter to these new ships, they had to come up with a fast and heavily armed destroyer of their own. The designers also faced an added problem: aircraft. As planes became faster and more powerful, a new breed of destroyer would have to be able to carry enough firepower to protect themselves and to destroy the aircraft. Slowly, a new design evolved, and in 1939, plans were laid down to build a new class of American destroyer, the Fletcher class. These would be the largest class of destroyer ever built by any nation. Its design was an engineering achievement of balancing ruggedness and seaworthiness, armament, and speed on a classically proportioned steel hull. At 376 feet long and nearly 2,900 tons when fully loaded, the Fletchers were significantly larger than any previous American destroyer. They had 5 5-inch guns, 10 21-inch torpedo tubes, 7 40mm, and 7 20mm guns. They were also armed with 56 depth charges. The destroyer would also be the first to be fitted with surface and air warning radar. With their 60,000 shaft horsepower engines delivering a speed of over 36 knots, the destroyer was destined to be an awesome fighting machine. And world events would soon prove it. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and World War II began. By 1940, the war at sea had intensified, and German U-boats began decimating British convoys in the Atlantic. While still neutral, one incident would bring America one step closer to war. On September the 4th, 1941, during a routine convoy patrol, an American World War I destroyer, the Greer, had 2 torpedoes fired at her by a U-boat.
The U-boat fired torpedoes at the Greer, which in turn responded with depth charges. Greer, of course, had been shadowing the submarine, and so the German U-boat skipper, in defending his ship, fired torpedoes.
Although the Greer was not hit, in a fireside chat, President Roosevelt sent a chilling message to Germany. With millions of Americans listening in on the message, he issued a shoot-on-sight order to the U.S. Navy on any German vessel found in American waters.
But let this warning be clear. From now on, if German or Italian vessels of war enter the waters, the protection of which is necessary for American defense, they do so at their own peril.
Shortly afterwards, another U.S. destroyer, the USS Kearney, was badly damaged by torpedo with the loss of 11 American sailors. These were the first U.S. deaths by Germans. America had been blooded in a war that it was not part of, and the U.S. Navy's destroyers had fired America's first shots of the war. Little did anyone know that this was just the beginning, and full-scale world war was soon to erupt, with the destroyer at the tip of the spear. On Sunday, the 7th of December, 1941, Japan held its aircraft at the American Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. Within 55 minutes, the fleet lay in ruins. America was at war. Immediately, the might of U.S. industry mobilized behind the war effort. Its Pacific Fleet had been severely damaged, and it needed ships to take the fight back to Japan. Along the length and breadth of America, shipyards sprang into action to build the hardware that would avenge Pearl Harbor. 11 shipyards were given the task to build these new destroyers. As ship after ship started to roll off the production line, the call went out for seamen to man them.
I was 17 years old, and I enlisted 8 days after turning 17, and about 3 days later I was sworn in and on my way to San Diego.
I'd been to Boy Scout camp, but it was a far cry from that because everything went by the book, it went by the bell, it went by the whistle, and the chief made us march up and down, and we had to go to bed at a certain time and get up at a certain time, take a shower every day, and shave. I'm 17 years old, shaving. I didn't have anything to shave.
Straight from boot camp, these men, some as young as 16 years old, were sent to the U.S. Navy's most advanced destroyers. For many, it would be love at first sight.
I felt that I was going to be assigned to a small carrier, which I didn't want. And then when I saw a destroyer, I thought, well, now this is what I want, and as luck turned out, that's what I got.
Well, I loved it immediately. That's called the Dungaree Navy. All one crew, really. Officers and men were one group together. Destroyer is a special thing unto itself. It has the speed, and it throbs, and you know you're at sea on those things. So it was something I found exhilarating.
Meanwhile, the bloody fight for the Pacific intensified. Japan had conquered all before it. American forces had to take control of the sea before they could start to retake the islands, and the destroyer would be in the thick of the fighting. In June 1942 came Midway. In an unforgiving battle, the US Navy's aircraft sank 4 of Japan's frontline aircraft carriers. But it came at a price. The carrier USS Yorktown was also sunk. At the same hour, 7 time zones to the east, the first of the new breed of destroyers was ready to enter the fight for the Pacific. But its crewmen would soon find out the conditions aboard a US destroyer were a far call from the comfort enjoyed by those sailors aboard the bigger capital ships.
Complement of the ship was slightly over 300 officers and crew. And the officers, they lived 2 to a stateroom, and the enlisted people lived 50, 60 in a compartment. And the bunks were just big enough for one person. You didn't turn over too much because you'd fall out. They were stacked either 3 high or 4 high. I was on the bottom bunk, so I was maybe this high off the deck, which meant I could get up easy, just roll out and start going.
When everything you own goes in a little footlocker that big, you know, it doesn't seem like you're needing space. You know, you got plenty of room. And as long as you got your bunk and mattress, well, you're in pretty good shape.
Heat was tremendous. Of course, you were constantly soaking wet in the tropics. And on deck, it was always well into the hundreds. And you had to try and keep in the shade. If you were away from the landmass and moving at a fairly good clip, it wasn't too bad because you had the air hitting you. But once you got into the channel there around Guadalcanal, the heat was just terrible there.
Hotter than blue blazes. And most of us went up on deck to sleep. And I can remember clearly being on the deck, and when the 5-inch gun would go off, I'd come up off the deck and bounce down, and then go right back to sleep.
The food, you know, of course, we had good food. You got a little bit tired of it. The old saying used to be that they had the best food in the world until the cooks got it. And then they changed it all, but they did a good job. And we ate real good, most of the time.
The food was horrible. You know, I think we had a bad cook, you know. And nobody ever gave 3 cheers for the cook on our ship, I'll tell you. They called out which watch was ready for lunch or dinner or whatever. And of course, they just called it chow. And you got in line, went through with a metal tray, and they threw the food on the tray, and then you sat down and ate it, you know. I can't remember having but 1 or 2 good meals all the time I was on that ship.
For the officers, life on board a destroyer was much more comfortable.
The officers lived pretty darn well. By tradition, they had Filipino mess boys in white jackets. A wardroom with a wardroom table and a couple of places to sit down. We were served on china and silver.
But it was the washroom facilities which were the harshest.
Aft, where I lived, we had 2 showers and maybe 24 lavatories and 6 toilets. And the toilets were a trough with planks across the trough to sit on and seawater running in one end and out the other. And of course, the ship rolled all the time and pitched, and it was always water on the deck, so your feet always got wet.
When you went into a shower booth, there'd be 4 other guys already in there. So what you did there was kind of lather up and get splashed from these other fellows, and then hopefully get enough water on you to get rid of the soap.
So there's always maybe 8 or 10 naked men standing around, either getting wet or soaping or getting rinsed or whatever.
It was an experience.
But within the washroom, there was one place that no one wanted to be: on the red seat.
Back then, during World War II and before, sailors who had a venereal disease, they were considered to have stolen time from the Navy because they couldn't have certain duty, and they were set aside. And whatever time that they lost, they had to tack it on at the end of the enlistment so that the government didn't lose anything. And so rather than have them use the same facilities that everybody else had, because might catch something, which of course you couldn't, we didn't know that, they had a separate toilet for that sort of thing.
By the autumn of 1942, Fletcher-class destroyers had arrived in Guadalcanal and were formed into an elite fighting unit known as the Cactus Strike Force. For the US Navy, it wasn't a moment too soon. Japanese forces were continuing to advance. The technology, engineering, and armament of the destroyer had to pay off. Lives depended on it. By early 1943, the first 5 Fletcher-class destroyers had arrived in the Pacific, ready for action. Known as the Cactus Strike Force, their first role was to target and smash the Japanese supply convoys that were ferrying troops needed to continue their invasion of the Pacific Islands.
It's something that's hard to describe. You have no lights. Not any ship has a light showing. And there were all sorts of navigational hazards which you thought of. As a matter of fact, we were using some charts that dated back to the 1700s. We got very close, within 60 miles of the Japanese airfield, so that's why we had to do it at night. And they were coming down mainly to resupply their troops, and they had a sophisticated barge system that would go hug the shoreline and go at night. So our job was to intercept them and try to cut them off. And their job was to get by us.
Already the role of the destroyer was changing. Once looked on as a defense for the capital ships, the new Fletchers were now being thrown into the furnace of battle.
If there was a strong point you wanted reduced, you called for fire from the ships offshore, and many times it was a destroyer that provided that. They would screen the larger ships, the battleships, carriers, cruisers, performing such duties as lifeguard. Say if a pilot went down or a plane crashed astern of the ship, the destroyer would be there to pick the pilot up, usually rewarded by the carrier with a gallon of ice cream or two for their efforts. They performed convoy escort. In short, any duty that needed a fast ship to go in harm's way, that usually where the Fletchers ended up.
The destroyer was a floating gun platform, and the 5 5-inch guns with their devastating firepower were its main armament.
The 5-inch 38 could fire a 54-pound projectile 18,000 yards, which is about 9 nautical miles, about 10.5 statute miles. Had a ceiling of over 35,000 feet for anti-aircraft. Then, of course, it could be used rapid fire for beach invasions and that sort of thing.
Ammunition from the magazines below decks was fed to the guns as fast as they could use them.
We fired 3 every 3 seconds, but they had to qualify that because that if everything goes proper, these men laying these big projectiles in the tray, they can't hold up too long loading them that fast. Those 3 to 4 seconds was pretty good for 5 or 10 rounds. After that, your fire slows down. It's dirty. You'd be surprised that every time the gun fires, you have grease flying around and gunpowder, and you come out, you're just peppered with grease all over your face and clothes, and very smoky, very noisy.
The Fletcher's 40 and 20 millimeter anti-aircraft guns could put up a shield of steel against enemy bombers and fighters. The 40 millimeter rate of fire was 160 rounds per minute, and the 20 millimeter a staggering 450 per minute, enough to shred an aircraft in seconds.
I was a loader on a 40 millimeter gun, which was a good position to be in. The problem was you were so busy loading that you couldn't really look at the plane that was coming in, and if you did, there was always a chance of you losing your concentration on getting that gun loaded. So I tried not to look at the planes coming in.
Controlling all this firepower was a command center deep within the ship. Packed with the latest electronic radar, it could locate the enemy up to 40 miles away. It was known as the CIC.
CIC is the Combat Information Center, and all communications and all the radar returns, all the radar equipment, and most of the radio equipment too was centered in the Combat Information Center. And all during any action of any sort, that's where everything was kept track of.
With its radar tracking anything that moved above the surface, the Fletchers also had the most sophisticated sonar that enabled them to hunt down anything that was below the sea.
As a sonarman, my assignment was to go up on the bridge where the sonar equipment was, and we sent out a signal underwater, a sound signal, and it went out until it hit something, and we could tell by the time that the signal went out and the echo came back, we would get the distance. And so we knew where it was. Then the officer says to the telephone talker, "Fire one."
Fire one. Fire one.
Boom, boom, it goes out. Then fire two, fire three, fire four. And so they're going out on both sides of the ship. There are three side racks of depth charges, and you have two stern racks, and two of them are going off at a time. The side racks are 300 pounds of TNT, and the stern is 600 pounds each. So you're putting a lot of explosives down there, and it doesn't have to land on deck. It just has to get close, because it'll open seams. And once you open a seam in a submarine, there's not much else you can do. Sink.
And sink they did. The Fletcher-class destroyers sank 29 Japanese submarines. But just sinking a sub was not enough. You had to have proof of a kill.
To determine the kill, well, we put a whaleboat over the side and sent a crew around to see what they could pick up, and pick up a lot of flotsam. Sometimes we pick up body parts. The second submarine we sank, we found a piece of lung, and the doctor aboard examined it and said the man had tuberculosis, almost an advanced stage.
But because the destroyers were always in the thick of the action, fighting at a close range, their losses were beginning to mount. On the night of February the 1st, 1943, the USS De Haven was spotted by enemy aircraft off the coast of Guadalcanal. Fearing that they were an interception force sent to block their evacuation, the Japanese hurled a full squadron of dive bombers at the De Haven.
I remember hearing, knowing that there was conversation over the TBS, the talk between ships, that there were bogies in the area, and they were suspected of being Japanese planes. But our captain, for some reason, decided to wait to see if further identification of these planes could be made. And he waited, I guess, too long. And I stepped out on the starboard wing of the bridge and looked back aft across the top of the stacks, and I saw the first bomber come in. And I watched the bomb being released from beneath the plane. It was that close, and I could see it. It's still a burnt orange color in my mind. It looked like the size of a large ball. And at that instant, I said, I shouldn't be out here in the open. So I jumped inside very quickly into the sonar room. And a moment later, the explosion went off. I think the second bomb that hit knocked out the engine room. And of course, the third one would have to be the one that hit the number 2 gun mount, went down and set off the powder magazine down in the bottom of the ship to blow the bow off, and just blasted the pilot house and the superstructure, pushed it back. I managed to pull myself loose. I just lowered myself about 3 feet into the water, swam away. I saw no other person until I was farther away from the ship. Then I realized there were other heads bobbing around in the water. And I looked back perhaps a few minutes later and watched the ship slide under the water. There were 167 men killed and 38 or 39 wounded.
The De Haven was the first destroyer to be lost and the 15th American ship to be sunk in the bloody Guadalcanal campaign. But unknown to the men of the destroyers, it was just the beginning. Darker days were coming for the ships of the Pacific and their crews. By the spring of 1943, the Fletcher-class destroyer had established itself as a relentless multi-role attack machine against the Japanese. Constantly ready to go into action, each man's nerves were on edge for the dreaded call to general quarters.
General quarters, man your battle station.
It was a little bit scary. Usually you left your helmet up at the gun, at your battle station. You know, it was hooked onto the gun up there. So you just grabbed, if you were dressed, you went like you were. If you weren't dressed, you'd try to throw a pair of pants on and get up there as quick as you could. And you'd go up and man your station and then just wait from there to see what was going to happen next.
With the call to general quarters and never knowing if they might be sunk, the men of the destroyers had a special way of protecting their valuables.
The few little valuables we had, we were always thinking what to do. We would put them in a rubber, we called them in those days, and today they call them condoms. But anyway, we would put all our little valuables in there and then tie a knot in this thing and keep it in our pocket.
On every front, they were involved in close contact battle, using every one of their weapons to destroy the enemy. But perhaps one of the strangest weapons they used was on the night of April the 5th, 1943. The USS O'Bannon and the other destroyers of the Cactus Strike Force were returning from a mission bombarding Japanese shore positions when the O'Bannon picked up a large Japanese submarine on her sonar.
Everybody looked, and sure enough, there was a submarine sitting on the surface. We had a Commodore aboard, and he wanted to ram that submarine, and the captain didn't want to.
Fearing that a collision could cause an explosion, the O'Bannon's captain ordered a hard change of course. As the two ships came within feet of each other, the Japanese suddenly woke up to the situation.
We got right up to them, and they paid no attention to us, and we were running right alongside of them when they woke up and jumped up and started running around it. Nobody could fire anything. Our smallest guns could not come down to that to fire on the submarine either. So some of the fellows picked potatoes out of the bins, which were right handy, and started throwing them, because there they were, And the Japanese evidently thought they were hand grenades, and so they ran and started throwing them back and throwing them off the submarine before they would blow up. And in that period of time, they did not get to their gun, and we were able to pull away from them and start firing. And then we came back and made a run on them. And evidently, we learned later that we actually did sink the submarine.
A fitting tribute to the men of the O'Bannon was delivered in the form of a plaque. It was sent by the potato growers of Maine. The relentless fight for the Pacific continued through 1943, and by 1944, the destroyers had been involved in some of the bloodiest battles of World War II. But it was during the Battle of Leyte Gulf that the fighting men of the tin cans became legends. On October the 25th, 4 Fletcher-class destroyers were on escort duty, protecting a task force that was involved in landing operations at Leyte Gulf. 2 of these destroyers were the USS Johnston and the USS Hull. When the Johnston had been commissioned, her captain, Commander Ernest Evans made a speech to his crew that typified the destroyer man's creed. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now."
I said he had more courage than was good for the rest of us.
Believing that they were screened from any surface attack by the ships of Admiral Halsey's 7th Fleet, the Johnston and Hull were completely surprised when heavy shells started to land around them. The two destroyers, the Johnston and the Hull, were in the gun sights of the Japanese Navy's center fleet.
There were 4 battleships in that Japanese fleet, 8 cruisers and 11 or more destroyers. And the Yamato was the largest battleship in the world. They had 18.1-inch guns, and they had 9 of them. And one projectile weighed about 3,400 pounds compared to our 54 pounds for a 5-inch projectile.
Captain Evans, who had promised his men that they were going into harm's way, led his ship in a David and Goliath heroic attack.
The first order I heard him give was all ahead flank, and which meant as fast as you could go. We began making smoke, zigzagging, so he told our gunnery officer to pick out one of those lead cruisers, and we did, and we made the torpedo run on it, and I know I stood over on the starboard side and watched all 10 torpedoes as they were fired. We completed our run, and then we turned, and we was trying to retire into our own smoke, and then we was hit for the first time with the 3 14-inch projectiles, mostly amidship. The ship just completely rose up out of the water and came down with a thud. That projectile, it's got a wow, wow like that, and it's a terrible noise. For some reason, I just turned and started walking forward, and I only got just a few feet. And as a round came in and killed most of those guys that I was standing with. And I look back and I recall, I can still see it today, one of my friends from about half up, and his arms are still moving.
Helpless in the water and pounded by the Japanese heavy guns, the Johnston turned to help its fellow destroyer. Its young crew members began to think the unthinkable.
And I truly believed that that was the last day of my life.
With the Johnston dead in the water, Captain Evans had no option but to abandon ship.
It was a bad feeling. You know. First of all, you know, you'd never seen anything like you saw that day, and you was one of those that thought, well, this can't happen to me, you know. Yeah, it wasn't a good feeling at all.
As the survivors huddled together on life rafts, they thought that rescue would come swiftly.
As the day wore on and the evening came on and began to get dark, well, then you began to wonder, now, where in the hell are they? And why aren't they up here, you know, to retrieve us?
Within 2 hours, the Johnston, the Hull, and the escort ship Roberts had been sunk, and the survivors were scattered over miles of ocean. But the U.S. Naval Command was fearful that if one ship should find them and stop, it would be a sitting target for enemy submarines. They issued a terrible order: permission denied to save survivors.
Our task force commander knew exactly where we were. He knew we were in the water. Other ships was asking permission to come back and get us, and it was denied.
The men had sacrificed themselves to save the carriers and protect the landings at Leyte Gulf. But for the crew of the destroyers, abandoned in the sea, the horror was far from over.
We saw our first shark about 3 o'clock that afternoon. Somebody would scream out when one of them had a hold of them. And we had a chief petty officer that one of them got him in one of his thighs, and then just a few minutes afterward got him in the other thigh. And so when they'd scream out, you knew that a shark was hitting somebody.
For the next 2 days, the men fought the sharks and the elements.
The water was cool at night, but the sun was hot in daytime. And of course, we were from here up, you know, we're getting burnt real bad. This little float wasn't very big that we had, and we put the wounded, most wounded, inside that, which was a couple of guys that was burnt real bad and couldn't see. Then dark or just a little bit after dark, both of them died. So we let them slip beneath the surface.
When finally rescued, out of the combined crews of over 600, only 147 survived from the Johnston and 86 from the Hull. The heroism of the destroyer crews who had helped to win the Battle of Leyte Gulf was summed up by the official naval historian. In no engagement of its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption. Following this victory, the Philippines were successfully recaptured. General MacArthur had fulfilled his promise to return, and a destroyer was there to help fulfill that vow. But for all its armament, the destroyers were small and vulnerable warships, and it was not only from the hands of their enemies that the men of the destroyers faced death. Sometimes, nature would unleash itself, with devastating consequences. By late 1944, the Fletcher-class destroyers were now coming off the slipways at an incredible rate of 4 each month. As soon as they had their shakedown cruise, they were hurled into the bloody battle for the Pacific. As American forces slowly recaptured each island, the price in lives kept going up. With the Japanese refusing to surrender, it was a case of kill or be killed. But for the men of the destroyers, death sometimes came from forces which even they could not fight. During the autumn storms of 1944, the USS Spence was part of the escort for Task Force 38.
If you was watching the ship, it put it clear out of sight where it would go below the waves, you know, and you think, well, it's gone. Then next time it'd be up above you, 50, 60 feet or more. Sometimes wind was so strong, if you into the wind, you couldn't breathe.
The next day, the weather became even worse, and then the storm became a typhoon. In winds of over 100 miles per hour, huge quantities of water swamped the Spence.
I was on the watch on that, and I had all kinds of rain gear on and everything, and the earphones, and you know, it seemed awful funny, like when the ship laid over on its side, and you're walking on the side of it, and then all of a sudden it turns all the way over and throwed me out in the water then. I didn't dream there'd be a storm enough to sink any ship, any man-of-war ship, anyway.
At about 11 o'clock in the morning, with winds now reaching over 120 knots, the Spence capsized. Of the 330 men aboard, only 24 survived.
Everybody that was below deck in the engine room and the fire rooms and that, they never had a chance. The ship upside down, there's no way in the world they could ever get out.
2 other destroyers also sank in the typhoon, and the mighty carrier, the Hornet, had its flight deck ripped apart. In total, approximately 790 officers and men lost their lives during the storm. But for the men of the destroyers, another far more deadly onslaught was about to face them. By late 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese, desperate to defend their positions, turned their fury into a new form of attack, the kamikaze. Again, it was the destroyers that were in the front line of battle. Their mission was clear: target and kill any kamikaze aircraft that came within the vicinity of an aircraft carrier.
It was a total suicide effort. First time I saw it, I couldn't believe it. They came in, and we were in a big formation. We had destroyers in a circle in the middle were the big ships. And they had to fly over us to get to the big ships. And I would see these planes coming in, and see the shells going out, and we fired the 5-inch guns because they had the proximity fuse, which meant they would explode and shrapnel go all over the place. And 40 millimeters are going out, the 20 millimeters are going out when they get close enough. And you just sit there and say, well, how can you get through it? There's so much metal up there that they're bound to run into something. But if it didn't hit the right place, then this thing still flew. So we just grit your teeth and you keep shooting, bang, 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 until finally you'd hit it, or it would fly over you and go look for something else.
But sometimes the kamikaze pilots targeted the destroyers. On April the 6th, 1945, the USS Bush was on picket duty off the coast of Okinawa when CIC's radar picked up a large formation of enemy aircraft.
We first spotted them about 50 miles away. We saw a pretty large group, probably 10 to 20 planes. And here's another group behind that. And then almost immediately a third group, and then a fourth group. And so we knew this was going to be a big one.
Within a few minutes, the Bush knew that they were the target.
We had a plane coming in at low on the water, on our bow, right for us. We fired everything to come loose. The 5-inch, the 40s, the 20s, all were firing, and didn't stop him. A very skilled pilot, and he knew what he was doing, and he hit us exactly right in the spot, the most perfect spot possible, and that is right between the two stacks, right at the waterline. Then about a half hour later, another one came in a little higher and peeled off and came in and hit us on the other side exactly the same way. And then about a half hour later, a third one came in and crashed into the forward right with the forecastle, and that was the most damaging hit in terms of people killed, because we had people out on deck there, and he sprayed gasoline, flaming gas, all over that forward deck.
With its hull almost torn in two, the Bush sank, taking 87 of its crew with it. In the weeks that followed, the destroyers faced more than 1,500 kamikaze attacks, and by the war's end, had fought in nearly every naval battle. In total, over 1,300 battle stars were awarded to the Fletcher class. But a bigger accolade awaited them. In August 1945, Admiral Bull Halsey ordered that 3 destroyers, the USS Nicholas, O'Bannon, and Taylor, should accompany the mighty battleship Missouri to accept Japan's surrender because of their valorous fight up the long road from the South Pacific to the very end.
We met the Japanese destroyer that came out of Tokyo Bay with the harbor pilots and peace emissaries. And we sent our whaleboat over there and picked them up and then transferred to the Missouri and to other ships in the fleet. It was quite an honor.
By the end of World War II, 175 of these tough destroyers had been built and sent into battle, but at a price. 25 had been lost. The hulls of steel are long gone, but for the men of the destroyers, the fighting spirit lives on.
Thank God for the Fletchers.
It was the finest destroyer that was ever built.
Be a captain of a destroyer. You're king in your own world.
I'd probably seen a John Wayne movie or something, and I was 17 years old, and I enlisted 8 days after turning 17, and about 3 days later I was sworn in and on my way to San Diego. When I went aboard, first went aboard, as I mentioned, I was assigned to the deck force in the forward part of the ship, which is the 1st Division, and then later I was assigned to work in the laundry, which was good duty. You made a little extra money and working in the laundry, and you had pretty regular hours. So for at least the last 2 months, maybe a little bit longer, I was assigned to the laundry, that the ship was afloat. I had worked in the laundry on the night of the 24th, and I secured about 4 a.m. on the 25th, and went to my bunk in the mess hall, and about 6 o'clock, general quarters sounded, which wasn't unusual because we did that if we were underway. And I went to my battle station, and we were there only a short time, and we secured, and I went back below and got in my bunk again, and then about 5 minutes to 7, the general quarters alarm sounded again. And someone passed the word that the Japanese fleet was 15 miles astern of us. Well, that does something to quicken your pace when you hear something like that. And so we again went to our battle stations, and I know when I got topside, I imagine the captain got on the bridge just about the same time I got to my battle station, because the first order I heard him give was all ahead flank, and which meant as fast as you could go. And then he said left full rudder, and we began making smoke, zigzagging, and headed back. I didn't know at that time that we were headed on a torpedo run, but we were. And so he told our gunnery officer to pick out one of those lead cruisers, and we did, and we made the torpedo run on it. And I know I stood over on the starboard side and watched all 10 torpedoes as they were fired, and then I don't know why, but I felt better by going back to the port side. Of course, they could shot all the way through the ship anyway, and but at least I felt better being on that port side. And we completed our run, and then we turned, and we'd never been hit yet. And we was trying to retire into our own smoke, and then coming out of the smoke and then a rain squall, and then we was hit for the first time with the 3 14-inch projectiles, mostly amidship, and then followed by 3 6-inch, one of at least hit the bridge, killed and wounded several. And then from then on, it was a constant hammering of one right after the other. When you were being hit with those, it was terrible. It was a terrible sound. And I know after it finally got, the ship was shot up so bad in my area that it was burning, and you could no longer stay up there. So I went to the main deck, and I was amidships, and was standing kind of under a gun tub, which was affording some protection, I thought, from shrapnel. And then for some reason I just turned and started walking forward, and I only got just a few feet. And as a round came in and killed most of those guys that I was standing with. And I look back and I recall, I can still see it today, one of my friends from about half up, and his arms are still moving. And I thought, well, you know, it's you now, but it'll be me in a minute. So that's the way I handled that, I guess, knowing that I was about to die too, you know. And I don't guess I thought too much about it, except my main feeling was, now how was my mother going to handle this? You know, I knew I was about to lose my life, but I wondered how she'd handle it. No, not really. You didn't see any panic going on. people were just conducting themselves normally, or normal as you can get in a case like that, I suppose. And I know when I abandoned ship, one other man and I swam off of the port quarter, and probably 75 or 100 yards. And we were about probably 20 or 25 feet apart. And there was a round came in and hit between us. And we didn't know where it came from right at the time, but we thought they were shooting at us, but they weren't. It was a ship out there that was still shooting at our ship, which was still afloat, and one of the rounds just fell short and fell between. So needless to say, we relocated after that. And we went more to the stern of our ship where most of the people were. And then after the Johnston rolled over and finally sank, I had a feeling of mixed emotions. You know, I thought, well, if it would go down, maybe they'll get out here and leave us alone. But on the other hand, once it goes down, they won't have anything to do except direct their attention to us in the water. And but when it did go down, one of their destroyers came up through those of us that was in the water, and I was probably 25 yards to port of the Japanese destroyer, and some were much closer than I was. And nobody was on the gun. They were. I distinctly remember people being in khakis. I don't know if they were Marines or what, but they were lining the ship and, of course, shouting at you, you know, and saying something. I didn't know what they're saying. They didn't really care, you know, as long as they got on out there and left us alone. And they did. Once they cleared they slowed down real slow. They probably wasn't running 5 knots. And when they got through their people, well, then they kicked you to head, you know, and went on over, because they was needed at the time too. They had a cruiser that was sinking, and they was trying to rescue, you know, the people that was going on that ship. So they was needed somewhere else. So maybe that's one of the reasons they didn't direct their attention to us. That first night, it was a long night. We saw our first shark about 3 o'clock that afternoon. I hadn't even considered sharks up until then. And we saw one, and he was a pretty good size one. He was working his way in on our group and came on in, but he never hit anybody at that time. But we never had anybody hit until after dark, and I don't know whether he was one of them or not, but we had people, we lost a few lives to sharks, and some wounded very seriously from their shark bite. But then morning came, you know, you're wondering, well, what the hell happened to them, you know? Where are they? And then about 6 o'clock the second morning, there was 2 guys said they was going to try to swim to Samar, and you could see the island very clearly, but it was a long ways distant. And so 6 more of us said, well, about 6 hours from now, we will also depart and try to make it. Maybe some of us will make it there and to get some help. And we did. And then about 4 o'clock that afternoon, well, I thought that we saw a couple of guys, and I thought they were in a boat. And we got a little closer. One of them said, we have some water. And I said, well, hell, they speak English. Maybe they're Filipino. And then as we got closer, I realized it was the 2 guys that started swimming earlier that morning, and they didn't have a boat, but they did have one of our life rafts that had been blown off the ship during the battle, I suppose, but it was pretty well intact. And so we joined up on that, and we hung on to it then the rest of the way. Well, I guess some people probably did, but I thought, well, as long as I'm breathing, you know, I've got a chance. And the only way you'd know after it got real dark, you know, when there was a shark around, when somebody would scream out when one of them had a hold of them. And we had a chief petty officer that one of them got him in one of his thighs, and then just a few minutes afterward got him in the other thigh. And when they'd scream out, you knew that a shark was hitting somebody. And I know I had a guy I was right next to him, and he got hit in the back, and took several stitches in his back to close up the wounds. But if it hadn't been for that Cape Lock life jacket he had on, it'd probably killed him. But the shark got a good mouthful of that life jacket, and which helped him. But and he just recently died last year, so he survived all these years. Well, I've often said, I guess, people who have never hallucinated can't really feel how real it is. I think we all did. Fortunately, we didn't all hallucinate at the same time. I know after we were in the water, and I had the feeling that I was drifted alongside a destroyer escort. And it seemed very real to me that I climbed aboard that destroyer escort. There was nobody on board. I went to the various drinking fountains trying to find water. Not being successful, I got back on the raft. And then a little bit later, it's so real to me. I said, have we seen any ships? And one guy said, yeah, we did see some DEs a while ago. Well, I thought, well, damn, I knew that. And then I got to think, well, now, if I was ever up off of this raft on that deck, why did I get back in this water? And so I ruled it out. I knew that hadn't happened at that time. But it was so real to me that, and it was to those other people too, I'm sure. And as one of our survivors, he's dead now, he said some of those people that hallucinated, he said, I don't think they ever came all the way back, and I think he's right. Some of them didn't. And they, even today, if they're still alive, have problems with separating fact from the fiction or what they think happened.
The USS Softly was a general-purpose 2,100-ton destroyer of the Fletcher class, equipped to provide anti-aircraft, surface and shore bombardment fire, deliver torpedo attacks, and furnish anti-submarine protection. Converted to a prototype anti-submarine warfare vessel, she has undergone extensive changes in equipment. Improved and enlarged ASW facilities have been installed with marked reduction in anti-aircraft and torpedo equipment. Her war complement of 309 crew members has been reduced to 264, with consequent reduction in living accommodations. But operating experience has demonstrated the need for additional personnel without additional living space being available, a common occurrence on present-day ships. The Softly's engineering plant, controlled from this throttle board, requires 1/3 of the ship's total crew to operate the machinery that provides the power to carry the ship's offensive weapons to the scene of action and to operate them while there. Propulsion equipment, such as this fire room, is particularly costly in space and weight in combatant types. This is the price of speed. Communications with other units are coordinated by Radio Central. Messages, both manual and teletype, are transmitted and received, and voice and visual traffic is serviced and filed. This is considered a commodious space in a destroyer. The Combat Information Center receives and displays all types of information necessary to support command decisions. This compartment illustrates the increasing cost of this service in space, men, and equipment. The 5-inch plotting room shown here in operation is typical of the complex gunnery installations, which make heavy demands on manpower and space within the ship's hull. This elaborate underwater battery plotting room exemplifies the Softly's primary mission of anti-submarine warfare. The installation of this complex equipment improves the ship's ability to deliver killing attacks, but the necessary space has been obtained at the expense of the crew's living quarters. Moreover, the number of personnel required to operate and maintain this equipment has greatly increased over that of earlier gear. Also, additional space and weight is utilized by the air conditioning installation, considered essential for the efficient performance of personnel working here. To handle ever-increasing paperwork and records, this ship's office accommodates files and working space for 4 yeomen. However, space limitations here and in other offices require much of the ship's paperwork to be performed and retained in the officers' rooms. The ship's laundry contains a washer, extractor, dryer, and presser, which must be operated on a 24-hour basis to provide weekly laundry services. The ship's sick bay has facilities for routine medical treatment, while the engineering log room adjacent provides office space for the largest department aboard. This, then, is how the crew works. Now let's look at their living spaces. This is the E Division berthing compartment before reveille. 70 men with all their personal effects and miscellaneous ship's equipment are accommodated in 800 square feet of area, 11.5 square feet per man. But increases in personnel necessitate the use of cots. Shops and passageways are pressed into use for deck space, and sea bags substitute for lockers, with dubious effects on sanitation and morale. Traffic problems approach a maximum at reveille. Even the bosun's mate occasionally gets trapped in the narrow passageways. As mentioned earlier, this compartment has 11.5 square feet per man, a reduction of 2 square feet below the standard of 13.5 prescribed by the Bureau of Ships. Notice what this means in the way of individual privacy and dressing convenience. To this must be added the confusion occasioned by ship's motion, the possible presence of additional foul weather gear whenever adverse weather conditions exist, the ever-present high-level noise from machinery and blowers, and the odors resulting from such confined living. Each transom locker shown accommodates 1 man, 6 cubic feet of stowage space for all his personal gear. Every bunk and locker in this space is occupied, despite 10% or more of the crew being continually away at school or on leave. Restricted passageways and ladders add to the difficulties experienced by the crew en route to the washrooms and topside, especially in rough weather. Notice the large locker in the background containing electronic spare parts. This utilizes space which would otherwise be available for personnel lockers or peacoat lockers. This is the passageway at the top of the same ladder shown in the previous scene. All the after-living compartments funnel traffic up through this space into the heads and washroom forward, or out onto the main deck through the door shown in the background. This crew's head has 1 urinal per 41 men and 1 seat per 21 men when all equipment is working. The after crew's washroom has installed 1 wash basin per 16 men and 1 shower per 49 men. These figures are very close to Bew ship standards, and these 2 spaces are considered better than average for destroyer types. Even when occupied, the after crew's head is considered large for a destroyer and far superior to the forward crew's head. Normally, the after crew's washroom can accommodate the number of personnel assigned, tattoos and all. However, during periods of maximum utilization, the presence of excessive water vapor indicates the need for improved exhaust ventilation. This space serves 2/3 of the crew and is considerably superior to the forward crew's washroom, which was too small to be photographed. Notice that no provision exists for hanging gear or for drying towels. To increase the available berths, the mess hall also serves as a berthing space for 31 men. Folded mess tables and benches are visible in the foreground, and the storage of clothing and shoes thereon is a common occurrence. Considerable difficulty is experienced in access to the lower bunks. The passageway shown comprises 1 of the 2 available routes from all forward berthing spaces to the forward crew's head, which is abaft and 1 deck above this space. The dual use of this space prevents late hammocks for the mid-watch, since all bunks must be secured for meals. Also, access to lockers is impossible during meal times. In addition to the inaccessibility of the lockers shown, Some are unusable due to steam fittings located inside. The ship has a total of 264 lockers for the crew, with the majority being the standard transom locker, shown here. Personnel in excess of this number must use sea bags or share lockers, as 19 are doing at present.